So I want to talk about victim blaming because I was thinking about this for the past week, and I actually wrote an article on it, link in the description, Misconceptions of Victim Blaming. Now, if you don't know what that is to victim blame is, say someone is a victim of sexual assault or theft, like their car gets broken into, and then someone comes along and is just like, yeah, well, sucks to be you, you deserved it. Like, you put yourself in the situation and you deserve it. The morality of the situation, the fault was the victim. And now, like, there's some people that probably think that. I've never actually seen them, but I bet there's probably like 4 people in the United States and 6 people on planet Earth that are probably like, yeah, well, you deserve. I mean, you can think of the Middle East, for example, and there are certain, especially spots in the Middle East where it's like, well, you were the victim of being brutally beaten. It's like, well, it's your own fault. You deserve it. That is victim blaming. But every single time I've seen someone say you're victim blaming, they've done it wrong. They've used it wrong. It's because they don't understand the situation. So I'm going to do more of they're dumb. I'm not going to do something like that. I want to do more of an actual like analysis and more, this is why they're wrong. This is the actual, the misunderstanding here. So essentially what happens is there are 2 kinds of arguments you can really make in this circumstance. You can make 2 arguments. One is the moral argument. You can make a moral argument saying we should do something because it is morally good. Or you can say you shouldn't do something because it is morally wrong. That kind of thing. It's not, and it's kind of outside reality in the sense of it doesn't matter the consequences. We're talking about if you want to be a moral person, this is what you should do. Or we can say this person did a bad thing, not because it was impractical or anything, but because it was immoral. That action was itself immoral. Even if it furthered their own gain or whatever, we can still say it's wrong. To make a moral argument is to say you should do these things or you shouldn't do these things because they're good or bad or whatever. The pragmatic argument is the analysis of, okay, this is the destination. Like, this is our goal we want. This is how we get there. That is a pragmatic argument. So it's kind of, in a sense, outside of morality. It's not talking about morality. It's like, the best example is the Machiavellian power politics. The idea of, like, how to be a ruler. Like, if you read, I'm reading 48 Laws of Power right now, and going through, like, obviously some of those things are very immoral, but that's outside the point. Nobody's talking about that. They're talking about how do you, like, the power politics thing is, if you want power, if you want to be in control, this is how you do it. Lots of those things are immoral. But if I were to come and say, well, I didn't like Machiavelli's The Prince because he said some pretty awful things in there that are pretty immoral. It's like, well, that's not a good argument. That's not the point. It's actually something that people kind of get wrong about rules for radicals. The kind of, in the sense that the beginning of part, it does talk about the moral sense of do the ends justify the means. That part can be morally criticized. But the rest of the book is all power politics. So if you were to criticize Rules for Radicals, that second section, or the majority of it, on the fact that what he's doing is immoral, that's not a good argument against the book, because the book's not talking about morality. The book is power politics. It's only talking about, if you want power, if you want change, this is how you get it. You have to address the arguments on those grounds. So same thing with, if I make a moral argument and someone says, like, yeah, well, is that really the easiest option? Like, is that really the best? It's like, well, I don't care. Like, that doesn't refute my argument, because I'm not saying whether it's easy or whether it's practical. I'm just saying it is morally good. Now, certainly, you got to take both of those into account in the end. Like, you need to take both the moral and the pragmatic argument and then decide your decision. Like, if you want to take the moral high ground, will it destroy you in the long run? Is it going to defeat you in the long run? And say you value, like, you want to, you would rather, you're fine getting power, you're fine sacrificing your principles a little bit, as long as that means staying in charge, that kind of thing. Sure, you can then take both of those arguments and weigh both of them, moral versus practical. However, if we are talking about just one, if we are talking about just the morality of a situation or just the pragmatic solution, you can't bring in an argument from the opposite side to debunk it. And that's what I think is going on with victim blaming. So, for example, we'll use sexual assault as the example, because that was the example I used in this article. So even though this came out last week, the best example I could actually find, I think, was from 2014. Those are linked in these 2 spots here, and I will leave, obviously, the article is in the description, so you can go visit that, click on the links, and hey, that gives me a view while you're there. It gives a one view to the article, so hey, much appreciated if you wanted to bring that up and follow along. But to essentially summarize what happened there were two victims of sexual assault in, like, the same week or same day or something like that, pretty close to each other, and the Ottawa police issued some safety tips, basically saying, like, hey, if you're a woman and you don't want to get assaulted, like, here's some tips. Like, nobody wants to get assaulted. Here's some tips to just kind of avoid possibly being a victim of that incident. Now, I think it should be obvious from this point that this is a pragmatic argument. They are not saying, hey, like, well, let's just remember that when women are the victim of sexual assault, they are also at fault for it. So here are some tips on how they cannot be at fault for it. No, that's not what they're saying at all. They're saying, okay, we get that crime is going to exist. Like, we're doing everything we can to stop crime. We know that it's going to exist no matter what. Like, we can never get it to zero, which means that we're going to put out some tips here and say, okay, like, you can at the very least, if you're concerned about this, here's some ways to avoid possibly being a victim, avoid some circumstances that could lead to you being a victim. That is not saying, like, that is not placing the moral blame on the victim. That is simply making a pragmatic argument in the sense of, oh, you want to avoid this circumstance, here are some tips on how to avoid it. And you could kind of criticize the safety tips in terms of on a pragmatic end, as they do kind of state things so obvious that, as I actually said right here in the article, the only real critique of these tips is that they are rather obvious, like avoid dark or isolated areas and don't enter environments where you feel unsafe. Like, again, obvious stuff. But then again, I guess if you're the police, you kind of want to cover your ground, so better too much information than not enough, maybe, was where they were coming from. But they have some decent tips, like make sure you have your key ready. They said don't carry weapons because they could be used against you. I mean, there are some people out there that I know that if they carried a knife, it would probably do them more harm than good. But that doesn't really seem like a good tip to me. Like, if you're worried, carry a gun, carry a weapon if it's legal, something like that. But essentially, the tips were just pragmatic arguments. The tips were just, hey, if you want to avoid a bad situation, here's how to avoid a bad situation. Simple stuff like check the backseat of your car. If you went to an event and you parked in a parking garage, make sure you park in like a well-lit area. Try not to go alone. Make sure check the backseat of your car that no one like snuck into your car and is going to kidnap you. Things like that. None of that puts the blame on the victim. They're merely pragmatic arguments. And that's what I find insane, that the people that are criticizing this are saying, like, oh my god, like, everyone, like, actually, I should probably say right here, an article in Huffington Post criticized the safety tips, claiming they shame and blame survivors. The article says the tips fail to recognize that the responsibility for the assault is on the perpetrator. Again, they're saying, like, they fail to recognize that the responsibility for the assault is on the perpetrator. So let's say I say, like, lock your car door. The biggest example that I can use. It's just saying, like, if we go into a bad neighborhood, like for some reason we have to go there, we're in like a city, downtown part of a city, and we and when we get out of the car, I say lock the doors. Like, am I saying if our car is broken into, that you caused your own, like, that's your fault, that the criminal is not at fault but you are? Like, no, obviously not. And we can say that by the fact that even if, like, if I were to go to a city, leave my car in a city, leave the doors unlocked, someone breaks in, steals the stuff, and leaves, when the cops show up, they're not going to be, like, assuming it's a good system, the cops aren't going to be like, well, I mean, this is your fault because you left the car doors unlocked. It's like, no. They're not going to be like, well, it is your fault. No, obviously they're going to say, yeah, the criminal is at fault, and if we catch the criminal, we will make them return your stuff, or we will punish them in some way. Again, that's how it will work in an ideal system, at least. But that's where, like, it's something that when people point out, like, oh, you're victim blaming, it's like, no, we're already past that. Like, you're back on step 1, we're on step 6. Like, this stuff is so obvious to us that we assume that the victim is not the one that needs to be blamed here. That is so obvious to us that we're not even going to say it. We're just going to move on and assume that everyone is on the same page, because that is such an obvious thing. And then when people are like, no, you're victim blaming, it's like, you're back at step 1. Like, come on, get with the program. Like, hurry up. You're behind here. That's why this bugs me when I always see an attempt to shut down a conversation. Like, if I say, hey, maybe we would be better off if we did this. Like, it's kind of like saying it's kind of like saying we should have, I'm trying to think of a way to word this, because I'm thinking of gun control, for example. Like, after a shooting, and we say, like people are saying, we need gun control. Why don't we ever see the people? Because, it's on the left is the one, like, I'm not just talking about liberals, I'm talking about the far left, or the ones that throw out the victim blaming thing, the progressives. It's interesting that whenever it comes to gun control, they never say, don't blame the gun, stop blaming the victim, stop blaming the victim. It's clearly the shooter's fault. It's like, yeah, we know that. We know it's the shooter's fault. And still, like, you find people that are like, yeah, don't ban guns or whatever. And both of those people realize, at least, that, yeah, the shooter is to blame. Like, wherever you are on the gun argument, both people realize the shooter is still to blame. And yet, for some reason, we never see the victim blaming there, but that is a rather right circumstance for that. But what I find interesting is it's just like, we know that. Like, whenever someone says you're blaming the victim, it's like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not, because we're moving on to the next thing already. We are done with the moral argument. That is all. We never even had to have a moral argument, because we're all on the same page. We are on to the pragmatic argument of how to avoid a crime. That's like, I just never, I don't get it. But yeah, we'll go through a few things I had here. Pragmatic arguments are not concerned with morality. They only focus on how to achieve an end goal. Once that goal is established, pragmatic arguments are made on how best to achieve that goal. In the case of these safety tips, the argument was entirely pragmatic and not at all moral. The safety tips recommended by Ottawa Police were a list of tactics. It is implied that any civilized person would not blame a woman for being a victim of assault. The moral argument is assumed to be self-explanatory because everyone already agrees with it. The police then move on to the pragmatic argument. Again, that's pretty much the point. Like, it kind of annoys me. It really does annoy me. That they throw that stuff out, because it's like, we are trying to stop people from being victims of a crime here. We're on the pragmatic end of, okay, there's going to be crime out there. We can do our best to stop it, but even if we stop most crime, there will still be criminals out there. And therefore, it's like, hey, here's some tips on how to avoid being put in that situation. And I like, it's I just don't get it. I'm just saying, if you've ever used the term victim blaming, stop. Like, it is not productive in any way. It is not if anything, I would argue that accusing people of victim blaming contributes to crime and violence. Because what you're doing is you're shutting down the conversation on how best to, like, avoid crime, on how to avoid being a victim of a crime. It's like when people put imagine, like, if I were to install, like, a security system in my home, and then someone would come up to me and say, like, hey, don't worry, it's okay. We're not blaming you. We're not blaming you for whatever. If you get robbed, we're not going to blame you. So you don't need a security system. Instead, like, we're just gonna, it's the criminal's fault. They need to not break into your house. It's like, duh. Like, I don't understand the, it's just so basic. It's just so basic that don't say it. That's all I can say is don't say it. If you're thinking of saying, if you're thinking of accusing someone of victim blaming, don't do it. It's just not good. It's not productive at all. It does not contribute to anything. And, like, I'm just thinking of, there is such thing as blaming the victim. And, like, 4 people on planet Earth do that. And so otherwise, I'm just thinking we should do away with it altogether. In an ideal world, libertarians should not have to devote so much time to fighting the ideas of socialism. Is it victim blaming to recommend ways for libertarians to oppose socialist ideology? Of course not. Whether we want to or not, socialism must be opposed. To point that out is acknowledging reality, not assigning moral blame to advocates for liberty. That was the last paragraph I put where I ended on. And I think that's an interesting, like, if you're a libertarian, if you're a conservative, if you're someone that's against the radical left, I think this is a good view to really look through it of. The people that say, like, don't victim blame. Imagine, for example, like, when I say, okay, this is how we defeat the far left. Like, here's some tactics on how to defeat the far left. And if you are on the left, if you are more concerned about the far right, or if you're opposed to the far right, as I am, when we're talking about, like, how to defeat the far right, imagine if someone just came out and said, no, listen, you guys are talking about defeating the far right or the far left. That's victim blaming. Really, we shouldn't have to defeat the far left or the far right, because they're the ones in the wrong. They should just They should just not be awful. They should not push socialist leftist ideology. They should, like, they're the ones that are bad. So by recommending ways or by advocating ways to stop them, you are victim blaming. Imagine if someone said that, for example. Like, imagine if someone put that out. It's like, no, that's dumb. Unfortunately, there are bad people out there, and you have to take ways to stop them. And when you take ways to stop them, when you protect yourself, you are not at all saying, oh, it's my fault if something bad happens to me. No. That's dumb. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say. Hopefully that made sense. It just, it's hard to really pinpoint where the argument is wrong, because I don't even think the people really think when they throw out the victim blaming accusation. But hopefully I did a good job. Let me know what you think in the comment section. If I missed the mark, let me know why. If you thought I was on point, let me know why. Like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. I've got a bunch of new subscribers lately, so thank you all for thinking I am worthy of that click. And thanks for watching.